and gentlemen, welcome back to our conference on behavioral economics and nudge in the Arab region. We are delighted to have you back and to seeing you again today. Before we start, a few reminders. Again, Wi-Fi is available and we invite you to tweet at us at any time using the hashtag NudgeLebanonConference. For now, I'll kindly ask you to switch your devices to silent and would like to note that this conference is being recorded. السيدات والسادة، سوف تعقد الجلسات الحوارية اليوم باللغة الإنجليزية. لمن يرغب يمكنكم أن تستعينوا بعدة الترجمة المتوفرة عند طاولة التسجيل. We will begin our first panel covering the growth of behavioral economics and the rise of nudge units. The next session will be about applying behavioral insights to health and the environment. We welcome our guest speakers for the first panel, Dr. Mariam Shammat, Professor Laurie Foster, Dr. Ramzi Mabsout, Mr. Faisal Naru, Dr. Eric Angner, and Mr. Zisoon. This session will be moderated by Nudge Lebanon founder and president, Dr. Fadi Makki, who will introduce our guest speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Hala. Good morning and welcome everyone to our second day. So, as Hala mentioned, the proceedings today will be in English, but there will be translation for those who are interested. But feel free to ask questions also in Arabic if you want. It's a great pleasure to have you here today. We're going to start with probably a bit of history. So we'll start with the history of behavioral economics, and then we'll go all the way to the rise of nudge units. And for this, we have an amazing panel. So the idea of it is to go back to 200 years with Ramzi. He'll take us back in time in a flash second, actually. And then he will talk about ideas and the importance of behavioral kind of policy and behavioral evidence for implementation and design. And then we'll go to a little bit kind of more contemporary economics and go to welfare economics and talk about paternalism, libertarian paternalism, all the way to nudging. And then we will go with Faisal Naru from OECD to the different types of nudge units. So the governmental, the academic, the NGO type, and the social purpose. And then Zisoon was not originally on the panel, but we thought it's symbolic. Not having the UK nudge unit is not okay. So we asked him to also be with us on the unit to share some insights on kind of the setup. And as probably you know, he will tell you more about this. They started off as a full-fledged governmental unit, and now they are an example of a public-private partnership. Then Laurie Foster will talk about another model of nudge units, basically the US nudge unit that was set up by President Obama. And she was part of that team in 2015 and 2016. And then finally, we have also another model, the French Behavioral Insights Unit. So with Mariam Shammat. So we will have kind of a diverse group, different workshop with different topics, all around kind of the rise of this concept of behavioral economics, institutional aspects, experimentation, and a bit of ethics. So without further ado, I would like to introduce the first speaker. Please make your way to the front. Professor Ramzi Mabsout. Professor Ramzi Mabsout is Assistant Professor of Economics at AUB, and he is member of the Board of Trustees of Nudge Lebanon. I have to say that we have had a great experience teaching together a course at AUB on behavioral economics, public policy, and nudge, which is actually in the final stages where students were divided into groups and they ran experiments on real-life challenges. So maybe we can talk a little bit about this. So we will, without further ado, I'll give him the floor. He will have 6 minutes, 6 minutes. We want to make this really interactive. So if you have comments, we'll make kind of as much space as possible for comments and questions. Be very straightforward, very brief, and then ask your questions so that we give as much opportunity as possible for everybody to chip in. Ramzi, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much, Fadi, and for the wonderful organization, and for everyone for being here on a Saturday morning on 9 a.m. I'm going to say a few words about history of behavioral economics and the relationship between economics and psychology, and then I'm going to move on to my slides, which I think they're going to be projected soon. Many of the debates we're currently seeing between whether psychology should be involved in economics and what's the relationship between the two and so on, these debates are not new debates, and we see replicas of them happening in the 19th century. We see replicas of them happening in the first part of the 20th century. And we go into, in the course we teach with Fadi, there's a first part which really goes into these details. And it's amazing how the debates were sophisticated in the 19th century about the relationship in economics and psychology. So if we read some of the economists there, you could almost confuse them with psychologists. There's so much psychology and economics in the late 19th century. So there are periods. So the main point here is that the two disciplines, economics and psychology, the takeaway point is that they are always in a, like two molecules or two compounds. They're always in relationship with each other. Sometimes this relationship is positive. Other times this relationship in tension. But economics and psychology, throughout time, they're always defined sometimes as a thesis and sometimes as an antithesis of each other. So, but they are always in a relationship. So this is my view of the history of the two, and this is how we should see that today. So I'm going to say a few things about their relationship, especially, is this?
Yeah, it's working.
It's working? Should I?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so today I don't have much time, so I'm going to say, I'm not going to talk about nudges specifically because I think we have plenty of experts here who are going to fill us with nudges and behavioral policy and so on and the details. I'm going to be broad, I'm going to be a bit philosophical and maybe a bit provocative as well. Okay, so first thing I'm going to emphasize that IDs matters and IDs are extremely important in terms of policy, for science, for a whole sort of things. Then I'm going to try to define what we mean by evidence-driven policy. Okay, so that evidence-driven policy, its main difference, its main antithesis is that it's not ideology-driven policy. And I'm going to define that, okay, because the word ideology can be misinterpreted. What is behavioral, about behavioral public policy? What do we mean by behavioral? And I'm going to conclude, continuing the idea, these matters because actually everything matters. And this is one of the most important policy lessons when we start looking at the agenda of behavioral insights. So let me begin with a great economist. I think many of you have read or seen this quote by John Maynard Keynes in his book, The General Theory. The ideas of economics and political philosophers, when they are right and when they are wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. The world is ruled by little else. Practical man who believes himself to be quite exempt from intellectual influences are usually the slave of some defunct economist. So ideas are important, especially for policy purposes. And this is where they can be very beneficial, and this is where they can also be very risky if misapplied. And we're going to talk a bit about that, but this is, I think, a thought that we should keep in mind. So a defunct economist, Richard Taylor, is not exactly that, okay? So 2017, the Nobel Prize winner.
Bubbling over with energy now.
Yeah. So, and indeed, there are arguments that it was unfair. I mean, but if it's debatable, I think there are many great contributions he made, especially when we look at mental accounting and other issues. But I want to focus here on the text written by the committee that awarded the Nobel Prize and the statements they mentioned in. So they say he was instrumental in creating behavioral economics, incorporated psychologically realistic assumptions into analysis of economic decision-making, built a bridge between the economic and psychological analysis, integrating economics with psychology, contributed for expanding and refining economic analysis by considering 3 psychological traits that systematically influence economic decisions: limited rationality, perceptions about fairness, and lack of self-control. Now, of course, you know, we know from the history of these two disciplines that they have always been in relationship, but what Taylor did is really, to some extent, bring them much closer together. So, and you know, we can debate a lot of these issues. So, the point is that his work also led to the birth of so-called what we now know as behavioral public policy. So this was a great impetus he did, and in the Nobel text, they also discussed nudges. They mentioned nudges. They mentioned there his contribution. So this is extremely important. So what we have to, what I want to talk about today is behavioral public policy. Okay. So what distinguishes behavioral public policy from other types of policies? Well, it's behavioral. It's fundamentally based on behavioral, and that means the integration, taking very seriously psychology. Okay. So, and it's multidisciplinary. That means that it combines psychology / social psychology, economics, political science, public administration, health sciences, and any other science or social science where behavior has some important component. So how can policy not be behaviorally informed? Okay, well, it can be ideologically driven. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Well, I take a quote from a very interesting book by Grossman on economic policy failures, on case studies of economic failures, and he says, policy can be based on ideology. So this comes about when decision makers grab hold of a key idea and use it as their own and only guide to economic policy. The idea might be a good one, but not appropriate under all circumstances. Okay, so let's say, for example, tax reduction. Okay, maybe like, you know, the Republicans in the US. Tax reduction, tax reduction, tax reduction. Okay, tax reduction can be good, but it's not, there has to be situation, there are contexts where tax reduction is good, and there are other contexts where tax reduction simply is not good. It's not just a good idea in itself and by itself across time and place. So now, of course, somebody might do a two-cock to me and say, oh, but isn't behavioral public policy also an ideology? So notice here what Grossman says. The idea might be a good one. Okay, so an ideology might be a good ideology. Tax reduction might be a good idea or ideology. Behavioral public policy can be a good idea, but it can also be badly employed. If you use behavioral public policy to defend exclusively, let's say, tax reduction, then again, this is something you can do, but this is you misusing the idea of behavioral public policy. Okay, so, however, I'm still convinced that behavioral public policy has an inoculation within it, and that inoculation, or that vaccine in it, is the idea that we should test and experiment all the time. Okay, so that might help, and that might make it more difficult for the ideologue to just go on and press on with his good idea applied everywhere and all the time. Okay, so this is extremely important, testing and experimenting to see what works and what not. Okay, so once this idea is ingrained, it's going to be revolutionary in terms of our approach to public policy. And the debate yesterday reflected some of these ideas. So, right, so these are all good ideas: tax reduction, minimum wage, compulsory health, increasing savings, reducing emissions. All of these can be good ideas, but they have to be implemented in an informed, evidence-based way. And behavioral public policy means that their implementation has to be psychologically informed. Okay? Now, one of if you read, I mean, I think most of us here have read Nudge, and there's a passage which I really liked, and that passage is where Taylor and Sunstein say, but we have a problem here, is that once we start understanding the idea of behavioral interventions and nudges, everything seems to matter. Okay, so we want to intervene, like small, tiny things, the colors, the shapes. So isn't this disempowering? And they respond that, no, this is actually empowering. Once we see that small interventions, small changes to our environment can have big, important effects, this is not disempowering, and this should empower the policymaker and give him a new set of tools and the ability to achieve welfare and other objectives as well in a very efficient and cost-effective way. Okay, so instead of seeing these as complications, we should see them as empowering the policymaker. So policy will structure choices in a way that makes individual better off, these kind of behavioral public policy, but we should also make sure that the person has always a chance to go out, okay? So these policy might be not the right policy for everyone. So, and the person who is not benefited by the policy has to have the choice has to have an easy exit, not to follow the choice architecture or the welfare objective of the choice architect. Okay, so this is one of the challenges, and how to make sure that most people benefit, and those who not benefit can do something else if this is what, and this is, I think, one of the main topics we will be talking about today in this conference. So thank you very much. And,
thank you very much, Ramzy. So to recap, what kind of distinguishes public policy, the classical public policy from behavioral public policy, are essentially two things. One is more injection of psychology and other behavioral science. That's one. And the second one is experimentation. But hasn't experimentation been part of these kind of last decades in economics?
It has been. It's increasingly, especially with respect to randomized controlled trials, and so economists have adopted these methods, these gold standards of identification of causal interventions. There is an empirical revolution currently happening in economics, which is extremely, positive, and so there's much less emphasis on theories, there's more emphasis on the correct method to identify causal effects, and this can only be very beneficial for policy. Now, the problem also is that we want these policies to be implemented, we want these policies to reach the people who take decisions, so that's...
And hence the partnership that we always try to kind of advocate for. Partnerships for successful randomized controlled trials between government on one hand, academia, NGOs, and to some extent private sector with a caveat. But I'm glad to see a lot of medical doctors. We're borrowing your golden standard, which is the randomized controlled trial, to apply nowadays on policy, which probably seems kind of for you intuitive, but we haven't been doing this. But now is the new wave. So we'll go back to more discussion on this. I would like to introduce the second speaker, Dr. Eric Angner. He's Associate Professor of Practical Philosophy at Stockholm University. We're very happy to have him. He's served before as Director of Philosophy, Politics, and Economics programs at several institutions, including George Mason University and Fairfax, Virginia. He is also author of 2 books, one of which we kind of used recently on behavioral economics in the class. Without further ado, I'll pass on to Eric, who will kind of continue the flow all the way to the different types of paternalism, libertarian paternalism, and nudging.
Thank you, Dr. Maki. It's a great pleasure to be here to participate in this conversation. And I want to say thank you especially to the students who are here, because you are the ones who are going to pick up on these ideas and make the world a better place. So I want to move on from the historical remarks and the general thoughts about policy to talk more specifically about the nudge agenda. The central question I want to address is, what is the nudge agenda? Where did it come from, and how can we use it? Who can use it? I want to go back not 200 years, but almost 100 years to the following cite from Friedrich Hayek, the Austrian economist and social and political philosopher. Hayek wrote, "It's probably true that economic analysis has never been the product of detached intellectual curiosity about the why of social phenomena, but of an intense urge to reconstruct a world which gives rise to profound dissatisfaction. This is as true of the phylogenesis of economics as the ontogenesis of probably every economist." And I think this is a wonderful quote. Sometimes economists in general are criticized, and behavioral economists in particular are criticized for being meddlesome, for going out of their lane when they're interested in improving the world. And that's not true at all. Like, economics as a discipline has always been interested in questions about improving the world, and economists as individuals have always been driven by this. There's a stereotype of economists as suffering physics envy, as being driven by a desire to do the physics of the social world or something. And the historical record just doesn't support that idea. So when behavioral economists talk about how to improve the world by influencing behavior, that's the most natural thing in the world. There's nothing untoward or creepy about it. Nudging, as Dr. Maki emphasized yesterday evening, is best seen as one tool in a toolbox of policy instruments available to politicians and other policymakers. Economists talking about policy will discuss things like barrier elimination, like when we remove trade barriers that allow people to engage in mutually beneficial trade. We talk about bans and mandates, which is a policy tool that's widely used and that's going to remain relevant. Incentives and disincentives is probably the tool that economists in general tend to favor. And nudges have appeared as a fourth tool in this toolbox. One insight of seeing nudging as a tool in a toolbox is that the discussion that we've had sometimes about whether nudging is good or bad in general might be slightly misguided. A better question is to ask, is this intervention relevant for the following purpose, in the following context, in the culture where we're hoping to use it, given the values of the people involved and so on. It's not helpful to talk about, say, the usefulness of hammers in general. You discuss the usefulness of hammers by talking about a hammer for a specific purpose and so on, and that's what I think we should be doing with nudges as well. What is a nudge specifically? What are we talking about when we're talking about nudges? There are lots of misguided ideas out there, so I thought it might be helpful to get a definition on the board. First off, libertarian paternalism is a thought that's appeared in the literature that precedes nudge by a few years. It's the doctrine that says that it's legitimate to help people make better decisions themselves by their own lights if it's possible to do so without interfering with their liberty or autonomy. So the paternalistic part of this definition is the part that says we should try to make people better off if we can, and the libertarian aspect of this is the part that says we should do so in a manner that respects people's liberty and autonomy. I happen to think that the term here might be unhelpful. My guess is that the original authors were trying to come up with a term that would appeal to the union of libertarians and paternalists, which is a fairly wide class of people, but in certain ways they ended up appealing to the intersection of these two sets instead, which is a considerably smaller class. And it's important to notice here that libertarian paternalism, by definition, avoids dictatorial solutions. It avoids manipulation and other forms of more heavy-handed intervention. A nudge then, what's a nudge? Well, we can think of it in terms of 4 different criteria. The first criterion is that a nudge is supposed to aim people, which we can call targets if we like, make better decisions themselves as opposed to making decisions for them. This is how a nudge differs from a ban or a mandate. We're not telling people what to do, we're helping them make better decisions themselves. A nudge is supposed to impose trivial costs on the targets. It's not supposed to be costly to be the subject of one of these. So a nudge is different from incentives and disincentives. It's also different from various forms of more intrusive manipulation like subliminal messaging and so on, right? It's important that there's no cost to the person being subjected to it. And then a nudge is supposed to have an asymmetric effect on the target, and this is just critical. So the nudge is supposed to have a non-existent or a trivial effect on people who are already rational and well-informed. So those of us who know what we're doing so in a rationally and informed way, we're supposed to be untouched by the effect of the nudge. But the effect is asymmetric in the sense that those who aren't already rational and well-informed, who are subjected to the nudge, are supposed to face a potentially large beneficial effect of the nudge. And the beneficial effect is supposed to be understood in terms of the goals and values of the individual herself, not the goals and the values of the individual doing the nudging. So here's an example that I like to use to bring out how a nudge differs from other forms of interventions. This traffic sign represents a ban. It says that you cannot drive straight ahead, right? You're liable to punishment if you try to do so. So this is a traditional ban. It falls under bans and mandates. This sign here, where I live, represents a congestion zone. So it's a tool that's used in the Stockholm city center to reduce traffic congestion. It signals that if you want to drive into the city, you may do so. It's not a ban at all, but you have to pay a fee to do so. So there's a charge that will be automatically sent to you by means of a bill by email if you drive into the city center. So this represents an incentive or a disincentive that encourages people to leave the car outside of the city center. But then there's a sign like this one, which represents not a ban. It doesn't say that it's illegal to drive straight ahead, right? It's not an incentive. It doesn't impose a cost on people who drive straight ahead. It's a sign that says, hey, if you're driving a little too fast, if you don't know what you're doing, you might want to slow down because there's a curve coming up. And this sort of sign has the intended asymmetric effect. Somebody who rationally and in an informed way wants to drive fast straight ahead may do so, but the vast majority of people, of course, will look at the sign, and if they're driving too fast, slow down a little bit because they want to stay on the road. And this is interesting. This example, I think, is helpful for a number of different reasons. One is that it signals that nudging has actually been around for a long time, though not under that term. Moreover, a nudge is just one tool in the toolbox. Again, we're not likely to be able to replace all the bans and incentives that we're currently using by nudges, but it might be a useful tool to use in addition to, or maybe sometimes under certain circumstances, instead of other forms of traffic signals. Another way to bring out what a nudge is to look at what an opposite of a nudge would be. And I particularly like this project. There's a project, I'm blanking on the name of the URL now, but you can look up these images online. It's a woman who's a failed student of industrial engineering who started designing things that are explicitly made to be difficult to use. And she posts these pictures, and you look at them, and if you're like me, you're experiencing this sense of discomfort, right? You look at this and you try to envision what you would do if you were faced with this sort of thing. Here's another one that's particularly charming. I can't look at this without sort of envisioning what I would do if I had one of these glasses of wine, and I fail to see how I would use it without spilling wine all over my shirt. And it's helpful, I think, from our point of view, because if we live in a world like this, we in fact live in a world like this that's poorly designed in all sorts of ways. And it makes it harder to get around the world. It makes it harder to attain our goals than the world has to be. If we live in a world with wine glasses like this, we can improve the world by building better wine glasses in this asymmetric way, right? A better design doesn't force anyone to drink. It doesn't force anyone to abstain. It has this asymmetric effect that has no consequences for people who know what they're doing, but they may have a positive effect on people who who don't. And so that might be nice for contrast. Finally, who's nudging for? Well, I assume it's true that the people who came up with the nudge agenda came, broadly speaking, from the center-left segment of the political spectrum. And I know many people, especially on the libertarian side of the spectrum, who are fiercely opposed to any effort at nudging. But more recently, there have been a sizable movement, I think, and a realization that the nudge agenda is really compatible with a wide range of political views. So here's a line from Bryan Caplan, a former colleague of mine at George Mason, who identifies as a libertarian economist, who's sort of fiercely libertarian. He wrote in a blog post a few years ago that nudging is a great idea. We should start by ending existing hard paternalism in favor of gentle persuasion. You can read the rest of the quote if you like, but the general idea here is that we can hope that nudging will turn out to be a second best. Like, no libertarian envisions a world with an active government as their utopia, but a libertarian leading person can think of nudging as a way to get closer to a sort of society that they would endorse. One important thing about this quote here is that Caplan clearly looks at nudging as a substitute for existing forms of hard paternalism, not as a complement to. And this is one of the questions I think deserve further attention. Do we want nudging to be something we add on top of existing regulation, or is it something that we hope to use instead of? It's going to be a central question to any discussion about whether nudging is a good or bad idea in context. Also, following the announcement of Thaler's Economics Award, Tyler Cowen, who is also a George Mason economist, here we go. He wrote this. He says, conservatives should celebrate Thaler's Nobel. His major idea in nudge is the most significant contribution to conservative thought in a generation. Cowen has in mind, in particular, laws about cooling off periods for divorce. In many countries in the Western world, divorce is available as an option to most people, but there's a cooling off period. You can't decide in the morning to get divorced and be divorced by the end of the day. You have to wait a certain period. And to Cowen, this is a way to attain conservative goals. If you're a conservative, you think it's good for people to get married and to stay married. It's a policy tool that you could use in a non-authoritarian way to attain that goal. So the punchline here is that nudging isn't, and it never was, something that should appeal only to a narrow segment of the spectrum. It really can be for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me just follow up on the exam. Can you show the fork one? Because, I mean, that could be, the reason why this is a very interesting nudge, and it could be very easy to do. So restaurants could default people into those kind of loose kind of forks, and then all it takes for someone to opt out of this to ask for a straight fork, please. So that could be kind of one way. That's what actually a lot of restaurants are doing on the straws. Instead of kind of banning straws, they will not offer straws as a default with their drinks. You can ask for it if you want to keep that option, or if you want to go down that route where you want to ban it completely, you say no straw. So very interesting. But I just want to hear very quickly, kind of, I'm not very objective. I love that concept. I do still think that this is complementary. It's not a perfect substitute for the classical tools. But what's the main kind of resistance behind kind of, or against nudging as such? Is it just being afraid of manipulation? Is it not trusting government? Does it, of course, it depends where. Is it a mature society? Is it a democracy? Anything you can add on this?
I think that's a great question. So there is, as I indicated, a very strong reaction in certain parts of the academic world to the very idea of nudging. I did a little review of these ideas recently, and people have used remarkably strong language to denounce the entire enterprise and the very idea of nudging. But in my sense, having looked closer at many of these arguments, is that they all trade on various idiosyncratic definitions of what a nudge is and what the nudge agenda is up to. So people haven't read the literature carefully enough, I think, in the vast majority of cases. And in fairness, I think the nudge book and some of the other early papers were written a little too fast. There are multiple definitions in the book that aren't entirely compatible. There are examples that appear that don't quite fit the definition they're meant to illustrate. And so I think the authorship team deserves a little bit of the blame here. But looking forward, for those of us who work in this area and who want to endorse it, I think it's going to be very important to make clear that we're talking about something that can be defined clearly and that has been defined clearly, and this is what we're talking about, not some other thing.
Great. Thanks very much. We'll come back to this a bit later. Faisal Naru. Faisal Naru, a great friend. He's head of strategic management and coordination of the OECD Executive Director's Office, and recently we're glad to have him as member of the Board of Trustees of Nudge Lebanon. He's done a lot on making information available about behavioral insights, about experiments, and recently a great initiative to show you here the various types of behavioral insights units and nudge units around the world. So that's, I think, we'll give him only 4 minutes because he's going to kind of feature in other panels. The others will not, so only 4 minutes, just to introduce the types, the nudge units. What's a nudge unit? The types of nudge units as a segue for the 3 different approaches of nudge units, UK, US, and France. The floor is yours, Faisal.
Thank you very much, Fadi. The map that you see in front of you is the culmination of a number of years of work, which previously I was involved in and I was working on. But now some of my colleagues, Filippo Cavazzini and some others, are going to be continuing. But it might be interesting for you to hear a bit about where this actually ended up coming into. We started working back in 2012, 2013, tried to find out what is going on around the world and what is really the interest in behavioral economics. We did a first mapping exercise with Professor Pete Lunn in 2014 to 2015, and we started to gather together these nudge units in Paris to have some closed-door conversations about, well, what's really going on and how is this really progressing and what are some of the real challenges. And from there, one of the first things, or one of the first pieces of feedback we got was that, well, no one's really collecting on what's going on around the world. No one, you hear stories and myths about who's doing what. Wouldn't it be great if somebody could try and collect some of these things? So we probably foolishly decided that we might take up that. And so we started to do this, and in last year we came out with a very large book which captured what is going on at the moment and what is the current state of play. And also, within there, I should say, is that there are 130 case studies of where behavioral insights is being applied across the world in different policies itself. So you might start to ask, well, what is going on? Right, so what is going on is there are different models being applied in terms of how to apply behavioral insights. What we describe really is that there is one type, which is where you have a central unit that pushes this forward. You have then maybe other kinds of units being set up in different ministries that focus on a particular policy area. Or then maybe you have a bit more of a diffused model, which is where you have a kind of a network effect going on. I mean, to date we count, and what we are counting, by the way, is institutionalized behavioral initiatives, not behavioral initiatives full stop, because if we did, that would be uncountable. But where it is actually being institutionalized, and right now the verified number that we have is 197 from across the world. Now, what do these actually look like? Well, the first thing we can say about these different initiatives is that 75% of them are inside of government, 15% of them are outside of government, and 10% of them are housed in multinational organizations like the OECD or like the World Bank or like the UN. And from those, 10% of those are central steering units. So these are at maybe the heart of government who are steering the activities that are going on elsewhere. 36% of these are units that are housed in the different ministries, and they are the ones that are driving it in the particular ministries. 54% of these are project-based, so they are set up to do a particular project, and then they move on to another project. They don't disappear. It's very important to say that. They don't disappear, but they simply move on to another project. And I think the reason for this is because when we try and have a look at, well, what are these units actually involved in and what are they doing, almost half of them are giving general policy advice. is that they aren't necessarily only focusing on one particular policy field. They're giving a variety of different pieces of advice on a number of different fronts at the same time. But then, of course, you have a number of them who are focusing on certain policy sectors. So it could be on finance, it could be on education, it could be on environment, it could be on anything like that. So you have a number of these that are involved in those as well. But I think the interesting thing also to think about in relation to this is that there are different ways that this can be implemented. I mean, we'll hear some examples here. Of how it has been implemented, but what we see, for instance, in different regions and some of the differences is maybe if we look at South America, maybe I'll talk about some of the less known or the ones that aren't going to be represented here. But if we look at places like South America, probably most of those are outside of government and they are beginning to be infiltrated inside of government. It's very interesting also that actually regulatory agencies are further ahead than, say, governments. And you could even say that about local governments. They are slightly further ahead than central governments. They've been adopting this for a long time. I mean, we undertook a piece of work with the Colombian communications regulator who's been working on this for quite some time. And using behavioral science, what we did is that we helped them to redesign the contracts for mobile phones, whereas before it used to take about 6 hours for a team of lawyers to understand what the terms and conditions in a mobile phone contract were, down to 12 minutes for an average citizen. I mean, this is the kind of thing that this is really being involved in. I think I'm probably coming close to the end of my time, but but maybe a couple of things I did want to say is that, firstly, I think the map demonstrates, and I think what we have said as well, is that behavioral policy making has gone beyond the disruption phase. It is now institutionalized. And that's what this map represents. The next step really is going to be about how it becomes mainstreamed. And I'm sure some of my colleagues will start to speak about some of those issues about how it can really become mainstream. But the last thing I wanted to say, and this goes to the points that were made before, and Fadi and Eric and Ramsey, you both also touched on this, is, well, what is actually behavioral public policy making? And there were two factors in the definition that you mentioned, but I'd like to add one more. And we have this in our publication as well, which, by the way, is represented in this postcard. And you should be able to pick up some of these postcards upstairs for you to be able to see. But you said that behavioral policy making is about introducing psychology and the other behavioral sciences into policy making, which I completely agree with. The second important thing is that it is introducing the notion of experimentation into policy making as well, which again I completely agree with. The third thing that I'd say, which is probably a more fundamental change, is that it brings into practice inside policy making the inductive scientific approach. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that deductive scientific approach is that where you come up with a hypothesis and then you prove whether or not that is correct or incorrect. The inductive scientific approach is to start with nothing and try and emerge some kind of finding. Sometimes you find something you never would have expected, and sometimes you find nothing. But the important transition there, I think, and the real fundamental change for governments here, is that it is becoming comfortable in being in the world of saying, I don't know the answer, but I know how to find out. Absolutely. And that is a fundamental change, because too often, and this is very important for governments that are trying to look at things like data, they're trying to look at things like how to manage the digital world, how to come up with new regulations for things like biotech and fintech and things like that, is that governments don't know. And governments should begin to become more and more comfortable in being in that area, which can be politically quite sensitive, but to say that we don't know, but we will find out. And behavioral science gives them a tool to be able to begin to actually find out how they can actually have real behavioral change as opposed to having assumed behavior change. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Faisal. Just one quick question before I move to Z. Have you seen a lot of traction within least developed countries? I mean, those countries that probably don't have a lot of capabilities within government. Is there kind of a minimum requirement that they're unable to reach in terms of skill set that is necessary to build kind of the nudge unit, not in terms of number, because we've seen that you can start with 4 or 5, like the BA nudge unit in the UK, even in Qatar, and Lebanon we started even small. So,
I mean, it's a great question, and I think that the interesting answer to this is that actually in the less developed countries, there's probably a greater appetite for this. And in the more developed countries, and maybe, you guys can testify whether or not this is correct or not, but where there are already established systems and established institutions in place, sometimes there can be greater inertia for bringing on some of this new kind of approaches. But where there is maybe a looser structure in place, there is an even greater focus on actually having the right impact. And that's where there has been a lot of traction, because of people immediately say that, well, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for behavioral change. We can implement the world's best regulation or the world's best law, but we have no idea whether or not it will work or not. But if you provide us with, some evidence, and we can do some testing, and we can try and find out whether or not this works or not, that's more powerful. And that is certainly something that is gains a lot more traction in lesser developed countries. But you're right, there is a skill set issue, but that's where there are that's why I said here, this is not really exhaustive, because if we start to have a look at all of the assistance that's being given, whether it's by donors or whether it's by not-for-profit organizations, they are getting a lot of that
Great.
kind of...
Thanks, Faisal. Zisoon is the Director of Youth Education and Skills at the Behavioral Insights team. Behavioral Insights team is the first kind of so-called nudge unit in government, set up by Prime Minister David Cameron in 2010. They started off as a kind of full-fledged governmental small unit, and now they are more than 120, even more, I think. That was the last count. And they are now a great example of public-private partnership. So they are owned by the partners themselves, partially, also by governments that owns a third, and Nesta, which is a Cambridge charity, also owning part of it. So a great example of kind of starting, being incubated in government and spinning off. I think that idea of 4 minutes did not work. So we're going to say 3 minutes Z. I'm going to cut it at 3, because we're going to see Z again in two other panels. So only introducing this because I really want to open it up to the public, to the audience for questions. 3 minutes.
No worries, done, Fadi. Otherwise, thank you very much for the kind introduction. Before I jump into some of my remarks, I just wanted to pick up on a particular thought that came from Eric's presentation. I don't know whether some of you may be aware, the original title for the book Nudge, so this is Cass and Richard's book, was actually Libertarian Paternalism. And so that was what they were going to release the book under. But then there was some advice from the publishers that perhaps that's not the most sensible decision in terms of getting engagement and readership. And sometimes I do wonder if the book was actually in fact called that, whether we would all be sitting in this room today talking about the rise of BI units and the rise of the approaches across public policy. So it's interesting how something as simple as that could have had a very dramatic and profound impact on the work that we're doing. But I guess just to start, Ron Rice, I just want to say how exciting it is from both a BIT perspective and a personal perspective to be sitting in a room today at a conference like this. I think back in 2010, when the team was first set up, there was a lot of skepticism across the UK, both in government itself, but then also more widely in the media and the population, as to whether, I guess, these kinds of approaches could actually add value, and secondly, whether people would accept them. And so I think it was hard enough in the early stages just to get one government department to buy into the approach and to actually run one project or one trial, and to see that contrast with today, where we're sitting on a stage now talking about the rise of units around the world. And as Fadi so beautifully articulated yesterday in his introductory remarks, seeing the approach spread so widely and seeing the work of Faisal and his team, just to see it all mapped out is quite humbling. To see teams in the US obviously in the White House and then in Paris in France, but then throughout the rest of the world, and including in the Arab region, has been incredibly humbling for us. And I think one of the real points of excitement for me is the ability to see it applied in different contexts and to really develop the evidence base of what works in different policy areas. Because I think the thing that we do realise in the UK is that we won't be able to test everything because circumstances won't allow it. And so the idea that one thing could be introduced in the US, something could be introduced in France, and start to build out that evidence base so that when there comes the time in the UK when that becomes on the policy agenda, we've got that evidence base in order to really start to develop it. So again, it's really exciting to be part of that. I thought, for my remarks, I would share some reflections, really from a practical perspective since 2010 about the rise of BIT and what were some of the key ingredients of it. I think the first part is obviously like the circumstances. And so 2010 is interesting. You mentioned, Eric, the remarks about it sort of being a slightly more centre-left approach. But it's interesting in the UK that it was David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister at the time, who would be considered centre-right. But it was the circumstances that was around that. You had a Prime Minister who was caught between many institutional factors. One was that the UK government essentially had no money, and so wanted to achieve a policy agenda that basically didn't cost anything. And obviously also being a centre-right government really wanted to introduce policies in a way that didn't require huge amounts of legislation. And also, those who are familiar with the specifics of it all, was also a coalition government, so passing legislation and passing laws was also difficult. And so behavioural science seemed to be the ultimate solution to a government that believed in the idea of like big society, that also believed in the approaches that I just mentioned. And so there was a confluence of circumstances that made the environment right for the introduction of the team. I think kind of linked to that is the importance of things like, I was talking to Mariam about it yesterday, the importance of senior leadership and senior buy-in in government. So obviously it came straight from the Prime Minister, but then also across the civil service, particularly from the likes of Jeremy Haywood, who's the Cabinet Secretary. And it's not just in terms of a one-off sign-off kind of way, it's a continual support and making sure that behavioural science is considered as part of every policy question. And the thing that I love about Jeremy is that no matter the policy issues, like have you spoken to BIT, have you considered this behavioural insights lens, whether it's talking about consumer regulation through to educational outcomes, even in international development as well. I think some of the other stuff that's probably relevant to pick up is, as new units start to emerge around the world, is picking the right projects and balancing the types of projects that you do. I think there's definitely a need for long-term projects as well that really start to hit hard on policy issues that we really think behavioural insights can have an impact, but perhaps not immediately. Having those projects as part of your methodology, but then also projects that can deliver short-term results. And that's been really impactful in terms of being able to get that buy-in from people across the sector, because there's nothing like a result in a particular policy area to encourage greater enthusiasm and engagement so that those broader questions can be addressed moving forward. A couple of the other things is like the combination of skills of the team as well. You started to pick up on
that one.
Yeah, Faisal, is it's not just about necessarily the behavioural science knowledge, but it's also the combination of nous in government, because it's one thing to have an idea, but it's another thing, as many of you be aware who work in government, to navigate the corridors of influence and power, and to maybe frame these ideas in a way that could resonate quite strongly. And again, just to, I think, wrap up, then there's a whole bunch of these factors, but I think on the BIT side, we're just really quite excited about, at a juncture, about addressing some of these bigger policy questions, like things that have traditionally been considered something that could perhaps never be overcome, things like corruption, domestic violence, education in the toughest contexts and such refugee. I'll share some of that later, but really excited to be at that juncture and integrating newer approaches like data science in alongside behavioural science as well. So.
Thanks, Z. I'll come back to you very quickly. Thanks for being very sharp on time. Dr. Laurie Foster, she is a professor of industrial organizational psychology at North Carolina State University, but also she has been part of the social and behavioral sciences team, which is the White House nudge unit that was set up by President Obama. So Laurie will tell us about the experience of setting up, and she's there, I think, smiling. So one of the things that she'll talk about is the kind of experience of setting up such a nudge unit, and actually it's still, relatively speaking, a very small team. So Laurie, to you, 3 minutes as well. We'll see her again in 2 other panels, so
All right.
Only 3 minutes.
Absolutely. So thank you for the opportunity. I was one of a number of people on this team, and I appreciate the chance to speak a little bit about it today. I'll tell you just very briefly about the way the team was set up, and time permitting, give you a couple of concrete examples of the types of projects that the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team worked on. I was on the team for 2 years, from 2014 to 2016, so I rotated off in the fall of 2016, around the time that we released our second annual report. The team was sometimes referred to as a startup within the federal government. So we were figuring this out as we went. Tom Khalil from the Office of Science and Technology Policy often referred to us as policy entrepreneurs. So we were figuring this out along the way. Our job was to work across the different federal agencies to insert behavioral science insights into the work that they were doing to help them do their jobs better. So this involved collaborating with the Department of Labor, the Department of Education, Department of Energy, Department of Defense, and others. And our team was interdisciplinary in nature. It was actually diverse on a few different levels. And so even as I look at this picture, I see people with backgrounds in cognitive neuroscience and social psychology and medicine, law, statistics, economics, international development in this picture alone. As Fadi mentioned, my own background is in organizational psychology. So we were diverse on an interdisciplinary level, but we were also diverse in a few other ways. One is the way the team was constructed. So we borrowed from academia, we borrowed from organizations like Ideas 42, we borrowed from within the federal government and agencies who were willing to donate their people to the team. And that provided an interesting mix of perspectives that I think served us well, especially in those early days. In addition, we were diverse with respect to career stages and experience levels, which was also super helpful. So when I joined the team, I was already a full professor of psychology. We had other team members who were graduate students who were early career and everything in between. And that enabled us to also share different perspectives and effectively get things done. One of the interesting developments that happened during that 2-year period that's not maybe talked about so often is the establishment of the Office of Evaluation Sciences within the General Services Administration. David Yoakum and Kelly Bidwell were instrumental in getting that set up, and so it was kind of neat to see that being built up alongside, and the potential and the opportunity for additional randomized control trials and behavioral insights projects that enables. So let me give you a couple of quick examples of the kinds of work that the team did. There are a couple of reports out that you can see these in detail. The first example comes from a collaboration with the Veterans Affairs. So basically, and I don't think this is unique to the United States context, when people transition out of military service, that can be an exciting time. It can also be a very difficult transition to figure out what to do next. And when that doesn't go well, then we see things spiral into a variety of problems. It could be homelessness, substance abuse, and whatnot. When that does go well, we see positive transitions and productive, well-functioning members of society. And one key to this, of course, is enabling and facilitating access to employment. But in many policy spheres, sometimes there's a "if we build it, they will come" kind of a philosophy that doesn't always pan out, right? So the program was in place, providing career counseling services to veterans as they transitioned out. But the reality was that people weren't necessarily accessing these benefits the way that one might hope. So the question is, what do we know from behavioral sciences that could inform this particular problem? Well, we do know from the work of Robert Cialdini, for instance, that there's this thing called scarcity, right? That we tend to value things that are a little bit more scarce and devalue them when we believe they're plentiful. So the problem at hand was the Veterans Affairs gave us the email message that they were using to inform veterans about this benefit. But it was kind of just a, hey, it's out there, you can access this benefit, kind of an email. And with just a few small tweaks, it became more of an email framed around, here's a benefit you have earned, which implies this isn't something that just anybody, in the whole world can have. Like, you've earned this benefit. We randomly assigned people to receive one email versus the other, and then tracked to see the number and degree to which people accessed the benefit, and found a significant increase across the two. So the behaviorally informed message was more helpful in encouraging people to access that benefit. The second and final example.
Second and final.
Yeah, second and final. It'll be a quick one. So this one was looking at people's, there was something in the federal government called the Industrial Funding Fee, the IFF. And this means that vendors who sold to the federal government were required to report the amount in which they had sold because they were taxed based on that amount. And there was reason to believe that people were underreporting, if you can believe that. And so we're thinking about how do we resolve this, right, with a nudge-style approach. And we know from years of research in social psychology that there can be some benefits to making people more self-aware. In the social psych literature, there are a wide variety of ways in which self-awareness has been induced. But there have been some cool experiments over the years showing that self-awareness can encourage people to behave in ways that are truer to their ideals, less cheating behavior and whatnot. So in this experiment, also a randomized control trial, the typical status quo was as such. Vendors would log onto a website, they would report their amount of sales, and the typical government form at the very end, it'll say something like, well, everything that I've just reported is true and accurate. One small tweak, one small nudge involved moving that signature block up to the top. Everything I am about to report is true and accurate. And here's my name, front and center, first things first. People logged onto the website were randomly shunted to the old version versus the behaviorally informed version. And long story short, again, a significant increase in the amount of money that was reported, which translated into quite a large amount of money for the federal government for a low-cost intervention. The SBST was keen to report results that worked as well as results that did not work in the annual reports and elsewhere. So that was important. I've given you two examples that worked because they're so much more fun to talk about, but not all the examples worked, and we thought that was important to report as well. So I will stop on that note and happy to answer questions later.
Thanks very much, Laurie. The last example will come from France. Dr. Mariam Chamat is the executive advisor at the French Behavioral Insights Unit at the Direction Interministérielle de la Transformation Publique. I can still put on a French accent. So, and glad to say that Mariam is a former Ayoubite. So, kind of welcome back home, Mariam.
Thank you very much.
3 minutes. Again, you're going to feature in other panels. I would like to hear about your kind of example and your experience setting up the kind of the French model, which is very much network-based and partnership-based.
Thank you very much. Can I just have the clicker, please? Thank you. So I'm very honored to be here. Thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm even more honored as a Lebanese and as an alumni of AUB, given that AUB is the place that ignited my passion for behavior, because there was this course here, it was called The Biological Basis of Behavior, and this is exactly where all these topics were discussed. And so I went on to France to study cognitive neuroscience, and 2 years ago I joined basically the team which I'm representing here, which is a very small team. So Stéphane Giraud and a colleague that's joining us soon. And so when I first joined this team, and I'm going to take you backstage and tell you a bit the story of how Behavioral Insights kind of got into the French administration. Back in the time, it was a prime minister's service, and we were, so there was this innovation team, which is in here somewhere, if the clicker works. And so basically they were interested in experimenting on behavioral insights. And the sentence which you said, which is we figured it out as we go, is exactly the summary of everything that's been going on for 2 years. So we've been trying to try different models. And so I thought it would be interesting to tell you about these and what failed and what worked better. So the first thing the French administration tried before I arrived in 2016 was a trial in 2014 and 15 with external consultants. And the first experiment they worked on was online taxing. So how to get people to file their taxes online with a very, very big RCT, actually with 2.5 million users. So it was a very big success, which kind of convinced them to start doing behavioral insights within the government. So a few other experiments were done on hospital fee payment and mobile phone use, but then in 2016, which is when I joined, they decided to set up a team within government, so not to work with external consultants, but to actually create a team. So this is the endeavor this is what I've been trying to do since then with two of my colleagues. We first worked on ethics, if the clicker wants to show it. I don't know where the pointer should be, but yeah. So coming from an academic background, my biggest fear was ethics and behavioral insights applied to real humans, not in the lab. So I was very concerned with this, and so we worked a lot on an ethical framework to be sure that we're not on slippery slopes and doing things which are not necessarily acceptable ethically. And we also worked a lot on the methodology. And given that back in the time we had absolutely no resources, so no money besides our own jobs, we tried different things. So this is what I wanted to tell you about. So first of all, we tried something called training action programs with public agents. So for instance, we worked with Mairie de Paris, which is the main town hall. And so we took on agents that came with us on a 6-month project where we taught them about behavioral insights, about nudging, and we worked with them on very specific topics. So they came with us to the field and collected data with us. And the idea was to try to see whether we could incapacitate different administrations and ministries so that they can embark on the project on their own. We also tried this with public administration schools, with students, and I'll tell you the benefits and disadvantages of each model. And we also worked on our own projects, which were things like operator switch, diversity in the workforce, so how do you get women working in STEMs, for instance. We also worked on fiscal civism, so VAT payment. And the main challenges we were faced with back then were the resources. We had no specific money dedicated to this, so we had to try very different models. We were also faced with the big problem of experimentation, so administrations would be very interested in working with us, but as soon as we reached the data, the experimental part where we really had to test solutions, they would either back off or say that the data was not appropriately was not there to be tested. There was also a big problem in timing, so the temporalities of policymakers is very different from the temporality of science, and when you do research, you need to take the time to test your hypotheses, you need to try to do things on the long term. So this difference in temporality was a big challenge also that we had to address. There was also the problem with the training. It was very interesting to do the training with the different agents, but there was also a problem of Dunning-Kruger's. I don't know if you know the Dunning-Kruger effect, where when you know a little bit about something, you start, your confidence boosts and you think you know everything about this. And the problem with behavioral insights is that it's extremely complex. I've been doing research for 10 years on one very specific topic, and it's still, I think I understand 2% of it, and it's extremely complicated. And when you try to give this knowledge to people who are absolutely not in the field, they might get the impression that they know and they can run things now on their own. And this is something that that happened with the agents that we trained. So now we're thinking maybe it was not such a good model. So I wanted also to share this. Another challenge was, do I have?
End with challenges and then we go.
Perfect. So also political support, which was one of the challenges we had, and of course ethics. So I'm going to end only with this, that we're now in new structure. So it divided into two. So now under the authority of the Ministry of Public Accounts, so basically of finance. And we have a budget, and we have a new strategy, and we have new people on the team and partnerships with academics. So finally, I think we can roll out, get out of this experimental phase and actually run a proper team and proper projects.
Thank you very much, Mariam. We'll come back to you very shortly. But let me really now throw it open to the public. So what we would like to do is 2 rounds of questions. And I think we've got microphones here. So if you have questions, do we have Fida? But please be very brief. Just 1 second. Who else? Do we have other questions around here? Another question here. And a third one. So we have 3 microphones. Do we have a 4th microphone? over there. Okay, so over there, over there. Okay, so let's start. Fida, very brief, please.
Good morning. Thank you for this
No, thank you. Go straight.
يلا. So number one, I'm inspired on two levels. I'm a member in the Lebanese Association of Certified Public Accountants in the Committee of Research and Development. I would like to do such research and the nudge issue as an experiment in our association. We will be working on this, inshallah. Next conference, we will give a success story.
Inshallah.
Number two, on the national level, we have to make this social and behavioral science team in our, I don't know if it is on the governmental level or the presidential level. So is it a recommendation from this conference? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Fida. Go ahead.
Yes, Catherine Skank Iglesias. I'm a demographer, but I also studied public health. And I was interested in a lot of evidence-based literature. There's a problem with taking that evidence and scaling it up. So I'm wondering in this field if there are lessons about how do you find something that works and then put it on a population scale. And also, have you looked at partnering with schools of public health, any of the nudge units, to look at some of the public health issues that you can be involved in?
Thank you. Please.
Good morning.
It's on.
Good morning. I have a simple question.
Good.
Do we know why this works? Like, we understand there's different research and different experiments.
Okay.
Or is it like antidepressants? We don't know why.
Great. And the last question, Hussein.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Shortly. Question is about, is there any literature on this, or what's your panelists' thought on having a central nudge unit versus having units in, I don't know, different ministries, different offices, different sub-organizations? Which one works better?
Okay. So let's take few quick comments. Maybe with the last one, best positioning, Z.
A little bit of a tough one. Obviously, we also have a bit of a vested interest as originally a central unit. I think the way that we've looked at it, and we sort of explored a number of them, is a bit of a potentially like a hub and spoke model as well, where you perhaps have a central unit to make sure that the agenda is being pushed forward centrally and has that senior level support from the center. But you also need, obviously, that specialist expertise in particular different areas. So like health, some of the challenges are particular to that area, and similarly with education, and the circumstances of context are really quite important. And so I think that's one model that we've really tried to generally promote. But then I think one of the other aspects of this whole agenda is the ability to take core principles about human behavior from one policy area and be able to shift it across different types of policy areas. So I think one of the slight challenges to let's have a unit each of these particular policy areas is that so much of the richness comes from being able to transfer insights about human behavior from one area to another and seeing how they play out in these different circumstances. So again, I think probably the jury's still out on a whole about exactly which is the best approach, but I think it's about, like most things, getting a balance of both.
Context matter. So any quick answer to the simple question of why it works? Eric, Ramzi?
I do think we have an idea of why things work. So there are some principles in behavioral economics like loss aversion and so on that are fairly well established and then play into some of these programs like the Save More Tomorrow program, for example. In many cases we don't, and this is one of the weaknesses of RCTs, right? You can establish according to all the norms that some intervention has the intended effect, but that doesn't in and of itself tell you what the mechanism is. So that's something you need to do further research to figure out.
If I may add something here, I think also a lot of the behavioral insights are based on folk psychology. And this is why we can relate to a lot of these findings. With dislike losses, we more than we like equivalent gains as loss aversion. There is, of course, a neurobiological basis for a lot of these behaviors, and this is where things can get also much more complex. And also, these complex interrelationships mean that folk psychology means that we can relate to these policies, but at the same time, there's also risk that we actually don't know what's happening. So this relationship between folk psychology and the neurobiological basis of behaviors are extremely complex and interesting research areas that you know, explain why things work and why sometimes they might actually not work.
Which is a lesson learned in itself. Mariam, do you have something to say on this one? Okay, another
specifically.
Another set of questions, please.
My voice is pretty high. I don't think I need the mic. So,
can we please?
I would love to hear more about some of the unintended effects. I mean, we all know when you design an intervention, there are the effects that you would like to achieve. And then sometimes there are both positive and sometimes negative unintended effects. So I'd love to hear more about that from your experiences.
So,
yes.
Just 1 second.
Thank you. Actually, I'm very happy. All the experiences here is that I had the impression it's from the Western world, even though there is some diversity in the origin of the person. However, I would like to know, have there been some experiences in in Asia, for example, in Russia, in other parts of the world? Because I want to see, have you seen a huge difference when applying this in the Western mentality versus other? Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Question is for Dr. Engner. You talked about a differential effect on people who are, you said, rational and well-informed. I was wondering on how we make sure that those who are less rational and well-informed actually internalize the thinking of the others so that they don't depend on the nudge, but they actually depend on their own thinking down the line to make the behavior a bit more sustainable. In other words, what do we do? Someone said yesterday on the panel, we're manipulating people. What do we do so we also empower them and that they have this rational thinking?
Okay. Mariam, you want to start?
I can take the question on unintended effects, and it's interesting because I recently read an anecdote that happened in British colonial India, where there were a lot of venomous cobras on the streets, and so the government started to give incentives and money to people who would capture the cobras and bring them in. So people understood this strategy and started breeding cobras and to get money. So the government stopped this, and then people released the cobras, so there were even more cobras than initially. And so they called it the cobra effect, or the Jervin's paradox. It has other names as well, but it's extremely important, and there's a lot of cases like this now in nudging. So for instance, you maybe know this example of O-Power, where they did electricity bills to show people their consumption of electricity compared to the neighbors or more efficient neighbors. And what's interesting in this example is that when people were consuming less electricity than their neighbors, they started thinking, why am I the only one doing the effort? And so they started, their behavior changed. So this is one example, but there are many. There's examples, for example, in Israel with crèche, so nurseries, where when people are given a fine for coming late to pick up their children at school, they start coming even later because they integrate this as a service, and the fine makes their
with an okay fine.
Culpabilité, their culpabilité disappears by paying the fine. So it's extremely important, and there's a very, very interesting book that's in French. It's called 10 stratégies absurdes, and I highly recommend it because it's all of these interventions that backfired and that had completely opposite effects. 10 stratégies absurdes.
Laurie, do you have something to say? Anzi.
Briefly, the comment about the Western world being largely represented up here is a very good one. And we do see initiatives growing in various parts of the world. The World Bank has their team. The United Nations in various ways is making forays into this territory, and other organizations like Ideas 42 does work globally, internationally, and in less developed settings. But we really do need to think about the degree to which these models translate into those contexts, because it's not a given that the way it works, and the White House team is going to work necessarily in other contexts. And it relates to the question previously about, what is the best model? I think that the answer to that is partially a function of culture, not just geographical culture, but also organizational culture. And adapting it in both ways is going to be important in moving this forward.
Z, go ahead.
So BIT works across the world in terms of running trials with governments. One particular example, which I think is quite an interesting one. So I think many of you will be aware of the social norms work we did around tax compliance in the UK. And so we've tried numerous trials around the world around that. My favorite example was a trial we ran with the Guatemalan Tax Authority, where we're trying to run trials around, can we introduce the social norms? It turns out the social norm around tax compliance in Guatemala is very different from what it is in the UK. So in the UK, we can say 9 out of 10 people pay their tax on time, and that's true. You cannot say that in Guatemala. So I think the stats are closer to about 60%. So the norm is still there, like 6 out of 10 people pay their tax on time. But again, that's not as convincing or persuasive as that 9 out of 10. But when we had conversations with our colleagues at the Guatemalan Tax Authority, they gave us quite a key insight. They mentioned to us that actually if you told most Guatemalans that 6 out of 10 Guatemalans pay their tax on time, they would be pleasantly surprised. And that would be quite something, and it actually might work. And then so we were quite skeptical as to whether this approach might actually work in this context. But then they told us, let's proceed. So we go, well, why not? And it actually worked, and it had similar sorts of effect sizes. It's because I think what was really interesting, it's not the absolute norm that's important. It's how the society or the citizen or the population you do it interprets the norm and processes that norm. And it's quite interesting. So I think for all our trials, we're always fascinated as we run them, or different versions of them in different contexts, whether it's in the developing world or other Western countries, to see how they play out, whether similarly or differently, or whether what sort of adjustments are required to do it.
Right. Thanks, Z. Question? Go ahead, please.
Yes. First of all, I want to congratulate you on this activity, because certainly Lebanon needs to be nudged in several different ways. Number two, I noticed here that Lebanon nudge was initiated in 2017, and you say that more Arab initiatives to use behavioral insights in public policy in Kuwait, KSA, etc. My question is, considering the tremendous evolution that is happening right now in KSA in Saudi, I would like to know what is Nudge planning to do, and in particularly because, yes, if you play it right in Saudi Arabia today with the new generation and the new leadership, I think Nudge will fly. And I think Nudge is required over there. So I'd like to know just what are your plans for Saudi Arabia, and what are you doing in Saudi Arabia, if anything? Thank you.
Any particular question before I ask each one of you to give literally a concluding statement, including perhaps answering this question? So concluding statement, starting with Ramzi. One final takeaway.
Two small points. One is the issue of scaling up, which I don't think has been answered. And I think that we have to be very careful, and this is a sensitive issue, and I think there is resistance to scaling up because we know that things are very contextual and time-specific. So we're scaling up. So what we have now is silos of experiments that have worked, which give best practices, and these are then used to experiment in some other place to see whether the same experiments or the same effect is going to work in that place and time. Unintended effects of policies, this is not limited to behavioral public policies. Any policy, any intervention in the world is going to have unintended effects. And which kind, whether there are specific unintended effects of behavioral public policies, this might be the case. They need to be also explored and accounted for, of course. But this is not something limited to behavioral public policy.
Eric.
Just by addressing briefly the question about manipulation, which really deserves a much longer answer. But it's worth keeping in mind that there are some very positive examples here. And I think Laura's example of the Veterans Affairs Administration is really wonderful. So in the States, there's strong stigma associated with accepting welfare payments. But so when you frame the benefits as something that you've earned, that might completely change, or as it did, the way people think about this. And it's lasting change that you can attain in a fairly simple way that is not fit comfortably with the model of manipulation, right? It's not manipulative to say that you've earned these benefits as a result of your service to your country. And so there are definitely ways to do this, and actual ways, not just theoretically possible ways.
Thanks, Eric.
Two very quick thoughts. The first one is, I think if you're considering doing this, I think you shouldn't think about capacity, whether or not you have the capacity to do this or not. You should be rather thinking about the capability, which is slightly different, but it's very important, and I think it touches on some of the points made before about navigating the system, understanding different things. And I think the second thing that I'd say is that context absolutely matters. I mean, very quickly, for instance, when I was in Ireland recently, they were telling me that actually in Ireland, there's lots of evidence there that social norm interventions don't work in Ireland. Very interesting. And there'll be lots of other things that you need to consider as well about what will be appropriate according to different contexts and what will actually work.
Thanks. Z.
Quick remark from my side is I sort of mentioned the excitement of units rising around the world and the importance of learning off one another. And I think what I would use this sort of opportunity is a bit of a catch cry that we should all continue to look on that transparency angle, look to publish results, both positive and those that don't work as well, so we can learn off each other and really then continue to focus our resources on developing areas where we think has the greatest potential, because again, resources aren't unlimited. So the more we can learn off the relative experiences of all of us, the better.
Thanks. Laurie.
So I agree with everything that's been said. Maybe I'll pick up on that question about why it works. And I'll look for an opportunity to elaborate on this a little bit later today, but I think there's probably a sweet spot between the ivory tower, purely theoretical, and the complete black box, right? And so finding that sweet spot in between, sometimes if we dig a little bit deeper within and across our disciplines, I think we can figure out why some of this stuff works. With the veterans example, scarcity. With the industrial funding fee example, self-awareness, right? There are theories out there, some of them actually kind of practical, that can inform and drive and help us understand this a little bit better.
Mariam.
And to end this, for me, the major recommendation that I would give, and to myself first, is to inject a lot of humility in all of this. First of all, humility on the government side, because we don't necessarily know what works, so we need to test and to understand. And also humility in the sense of reconciling with complexity, because all of this is extremely complex. Behavior change is very complex. We're still at the very beginning of understanding anything about behavior. And so there's no magical wand solutions. The problems are difficult and change every day, and we need to find solutions every day for the new problems. So ending on humility and patience.
Absolutely, humility. If that has taught me anything over the last 4 years, when I stumbled upon behavioral economics and behavioral sciences, and I proudly say never recovered, it did teach me humility. You can be wrong on so many different things until you kind of experiment and look at it more kind of thoroughly. So with that, I thank you for being a great audience. I thank the speakers, and I think let's give them a big round of applause. And let's move immediately to the health session. Dean Whitehead, I do apologize. We took from your session. We'll give you that back.
Thank you, doctors and professors. I would like to invite our guests, Dr. Rabia Muhtar, Dr. Rabia Al-Shamma'i, Dr. Umar Taj, Professor Laurie Foster, you can stay, Dr. Ali Asayran, and Dr. Kay Rugari to take their seats on stage.